All right, in this section, we're going to go over the nervous system. So the nervous system is going to be responsible for integrating and coordinating all of the body's activities, and it can be broken down into two main divisions. There's the central nervous system, which falls down the center line of the body, so the brain, the spinal cord, and then there's the peripheral nervous system, which includes all of the other nervous tissue throughout the body. That is not brain and spinal cord. So here we have our central nervous system. Branching out from that, we have our peripheral nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system can be broken down even further based on its function. So there's the somatic nervous system, which is responsible for receiving sensory information and directing our voluntary movements, and the autonomic nervous system, which regulates all of our involuntary activities. The autonomic nervous system is then broken down even further into what type of involuntary activities it regulates. So, for example, the sympathetic nervous system is in charge during our emergencies. This is our fight or flight response. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to adjust bodily functions during restful times. So this will be our rest and digest sort of time. So here is the organization of the nervous system. We have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then from there, everything else is going to be the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system can be broken down into the sensory neurons and the motor neurons, those that bring information to the brain, those that take information from the brain and bring it out to the muscles and organs that are its effectors. That can then be broken further into the somatic and autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is responsible for signaling to our voluntary muscle control, whereas the autonomic nervous system is again responsible for those automatic processes. Either our sympathetic, which would be our fight or flight response, and our parasympathetic, the rest and digest. So we're going to give sort of a general overview of the nervous system and then break down neurons on a more specific level. So starting off with the functions, the main functions of the nervous system. The first is going to be sensory. This is because we use the nervous system to we have sensory receptors, part of the nervous system, to respond to stimuli by generating nerve signals that travel through the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. The central nervous system is also responsible for integration. So not only is it taking information from the outside world, but it then needs to process that information. So that would be the central nervous system. It sums up the input it receives from all over the body, stores memory, and creates a motor response. Takes that information, processes that information, stores that information, and then responds to that information. It does this through the motor neurons. The motor neurons are going to generate a motor output, which is going to travel from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system, or through the peripheral nervous system, ultimately to muscles, glands, and organs, whatever it is that we need to affect based on the sensory information that we picked up. So nervous tissue, or the nervous system, is going to be, like I said, responsible for integrating and coordinating all of the body's activities, and it can be broken down into those two main divisions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. However, both of these systems are ultimately going to be composed of two types of specialized cells. There are neurons, which may also be called nerve cells. These are going to be responsible for generating and transmitting messages. Whether we are getting that information as a sensory neuron, we're picking up that information from the outside world, taking it to the brain, or we're taking that information from the brain to the rest of the body, those are neurons. They are responsible for generating and transmitting those messages. But we also have neuroglia cells. Neuroglia cells are, you may also hear them referred to as glial cells. Their primary goal is going to be support and protection of the nerve cells. They can be broken down further and described by their specific functions. Some provide structural support to the neurons of the central nervous system. Some provide the neurons with nerve growth factors, a steady stream of chemicals that stimulate that nerve growth. Some form a protective sheath around different portions of the nerve cells. So they'll have a variety of functions. But because their primary goal is going to be support, they tend to outnumber the neurons by 10 to 1. So there's way more supporting cells than there are neurons. Microglia, for example, are phagocytic cells that remove bacteria and debris. Astrocytes provide metabolic and structural support directly to the neurons. Oligodendrocytes form myelin sheaths in the central nervous system. Schwann cells form myelin sheaths in the peripheral nervous system. And we'll talk about those myelin sheaths in just a few slides. So there are specific categories that we use to classify and describe the different types of neurons. So we've talked about how there are neurons and neuroglia. Now we're going to focus on neurons themselves. Starting off with our sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are also known as afferent neurons. These are going to be responsible for conducting information toward the brain and the spinal cord. So where would these come from? Where would you suspect that you would find these sensory neurons? What kind of information are they going to be transmitting? All right, these are going to be responsible for, typically they're going to be coming from your sensory receptors, and they're going to be taking sensory information to the brain. So this will be information coming from your eyes, your ears, your fingers, your skin. They're going to be taking that information, sensing from the environment, and bringing that information to the brain. Motor neurons are efferent neurons, are carrying that information away from the brain and the spinal cord. So they're carrying the information away from the brain, away from the spinal cord, and out into the rest of the body. So what kind of information would you expect them to be carrying? They're carrying this information to the effector muscles or glands that need to respond to the messages from the brain. So the information they're going to be carrying is like, hey, based on the information we just received, here's how you should respond. For example, when you pick up something hot, that information that, oh, this is hot, travels to your brain. And then your brain then sends the message to your hand. Yeah, that's real hot. Don't touch it. Set that down. Back away. That information, that motor, that neuron, that information relay coming from your sensory organs and your fingertips to the brain where it's going to be processed, and then it's going to send that information down through your motor neurons. It's going to affect the muscles in your hand to pull away from that hot thing that you just touched. Now, a very important part of this whole system is it's not enough to just have sensory neurons and motor neurons. We also have to have interneurons. Interneurons are the association neurons. These are going to be typically located along the central nervous system between the sensory and the motor neurons. These are the ones who are going to be processing our information. So sensory neurons pick up the information from the environment, bring it to the interneurons who process that information and go, hey, what should we do with that? Hey, let's do this action. Let's pull our hand away from the hot thing. And it's going to send that information down through your motor neurons to pull your hand away. So these are going to be responsible for integrating, interpreting the sensory signals. These are going to be the most common neurons. They're going to account for almost 99% of all the neurons that are found in the body are going to be responsible for processing that information. Just as an example of a homeostatic imbalance associated with this system would be ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. It's a very progressive disease that targets motor neurons. So the sensory neurons are left intact. You can still sense everything in the environment. The interneurons are completely intact. You can still process everything that's happening around you. But the motor neurons are going to be affected. They're going to die off and stop sending messages to the muscles from the brain. Unfortunately, the sensory and interneurons are not affected by this disease. So awareness and reasoning remain intact until complete respiratory failure. My grandmother passed away from this just a year ago. And it's a very, very difficult disease to watch happen, because the very first thing to go was her speech. She lost fine control over her tongue and mouth and facial muscles. But she's still sharp as a tack, very much in there, very much aware of everything that's going on around her, just unable to communicate with the world. The very unfortunate thing with ALS is one of the last things to go is respiratory failure. So what happens is, although the body can still receive information, can still process information, the information doesn't go towards the rest of the body, doesn't go towards your lungs, and eventually your lungs just aren't receiving the message to continue to breathe. So it's a very, very painful and unpleasant way to go. But yes, so that's an example of a homeostatic imbalance associated with these neurons. And it's interesting. It's a very specific disorder. It specifically attacks motor neurons, not sensory or interneurons. But moving on to the anatomy of a neuron. Neurons have three structures: cell body, dendrites, and an axon. Now the cell body is going to contain the nucleus. So that's going to be this portion right up here. This is going to contain the nucleus and all the other organelles. So everything that the cell is able to do, it does it up here within the cell body. Branching out from the cell body, we have dendrites. Dendrites are going to be these short little extensions off of that cell body that receive signals from sensory receptors and other neurons. So these are going to be the ones responsible for picking up that information, and then it's going to be sent through the cell body and then transmitted along the axon. Now, the axon is this portion right here. It's a portion of the neuron that conducts the nerve impulses. So the dendrites collect that information. The axons transmit that information. These are going to be really long. Individual axons are going to be termed nerve fibers, and collectively a bundle of these are going to form a nerve. These axons are going to branch down, and these axon terminals will end at whatever region they are affecting. So they could end at a muscle if we are a motor neuron and we're affecting that muscle. They could end at simply another neuron if they're going to end at an interneuron. So here is a sensory receptor, or it's going to pick up that information, pass it along that axon, drop it off at an interneuron. That interneuron is going to process that information, send it to a motor neuron, and which will pass that information back to whatever muscle it needs to, or whatever organ it needs to. So as we mentioned earlier, there are a lot of supporting neuroglia. One of those are going to be the neuroglia that are responsible for forming of myelin sheath. So these are located in the peripheral nervous system. So Schwann cells are going to, it's just a type of glial cell, are going to form a myelin sheath. They're going to wrap around the axons. They're going to wrap around the axon many, many times, and they're going to form these little sort of insulating protective barriers. Now, the space in between each one of these is called a node of Ranvier. This is the space between the myelin sheaths. Long axons usually have myelin sheaths. Short axons typically don't have them, don't really need them. The gray matter inside of the gray matter of the central nervous system is gray because it does not contain myelinated axons. White matter is white because it does. So when you hear of gray matter or white matter, it's due to the presence of these myelin sheaths or the lack thereof. Another homeostatic imbalance associated with neurons would be the multiple sclerosis, MS. This is where the myelin sheath is actually going to start to break down. Now, the problem with this is that the neurons can't transmit the information. So this does not necessarily target just motor neurons. It can also attack sensory neurons and interneurons. The problem is those neurons just simply cannot transmit the information. The myelin sheath is very important in nerve regeneration within the peripheral nervous system. So if an axon is severed, the myelin sheath can remain, and it can serve as a passageway for a new fiber to grow along that myelin sheath. So the neuron membranes are going to be designed and specialized for communication. The messages that the nerves send to one another are called nerve impulses or action potentials. You'll see both terms used in this course. I'm not going to be particular, but you may want to be familiar with them for any courses in the future. We're actually going to just pause here for a moment, and we'll pick up again with the physiology of a neuron in our next video.